Hello.
How you doing, man?
Really good. Thank you so much for joining us, Jason. Thank you, everybody who's here. It looks like we've got around 300 of you in the audience so far. Welcome to the Decameron Project's virtual conversation with the visionary Jason Reynolds. I'm Lucas Gimbel, a founder of the project, and I'm going to be one of your hosts this evening alongside Kanisha Mahajan. Kanisha is a sophomore at Stuyvesant in New York City, and she's also a member of one of NYC Service's many youth leadership councils. We're proud to bring you Jason today with the help of NYC Service and the New York Public Libraries, who have been so kind as to make all of Jason's work available for free as long as you live in New York and can get that library card. So a huge thanks to them and to all of you for joining us. But most of all, thank you again, Jason, for joining us. It's truly an honor to have you here.
My pleasure. My pleasure, man.
Great. So we'll get right into it then. And I wanted to start the interview by asking you a question that I've seen asked a few other places. You first read a book cover to cover when you were 17.
Mm.
After all that time not reading, what finally brought you into the world of reading and writing?
Plot. It's interesting. I think we romanticize reading sometimes as it pertains to the reading that we do in school or the reading that we ask young people to do in school. Truth of the matter is, a lot of it's boring, right? Like, that's a fact. You know what I mean? We don't like talking about it that way because adults have ego, right? But the truth is that a lot of the books that were, when I was growing up, a lot of the books that were being asked of me to read were 50 pages of exposition before something interesting happened in the story. Adults don't even like to read books with 50 pages of exposition, right? Like, at 37 years old, I'm gonna give you 25 pages before I back out of the book. Who has the time, right? Like, life is short. And if that was me, 30 years ago, imagine how much shorter the attention spans are now. You have even less time. And so the reason that I read that book at 17, almost 18, is because on page 2, something happened. Our movies, like, think about it, everywhere else in our lives, right? Movies, 5 minutes in, something happens, right? When you think about theater, right? Something happens. When you think about all the things on the internet, video games, YouTube, something happens within the first 5 minutes. No one is going to play Zelda for 6 hours and nothing happens. No one's going to play Fortnite and no one shows up. It's like, I got to see somebody else at some point, right? And I think that we have to be honest about it. It's not that I hated to read, I just hated to be bored.
No, and it's super interesting that you mentioned that, and I know that's a big theme in your writing career. Yeah. But to circle back, was that experience of not having read a book cover to cover, was that experience unusual? Do you think, for kids your age?
No. People make a lot of the story about it because I became a writer, right? That's what's unusual. You know what I mean? But none of my friends read. None of my family members read. Nobody, like, it just wasn't a part of our lives because reading always felt like work. I mean, think about it. I mean, look, let me be honest, right? And my whole life until I was an adult, reading was attached to a letter grade. And so reading came with a certain kind of weight to it, right? And people spoke about reading in this way that we still speak about it, which I understand, but I think that we should probably figure out new ways to articulate its importance. People spoke about reading as if your ability to do it or not do it was sort of, that there was a value judgment placed on you based on your relationship with literature, right? So there's all this stuff about, like, oh, if you don't read, then it means this, and this about you. Never taking into consideration literacy rates in certain communities, never taking into consideration access to books, right, in certain communities, yeah. Right? And furthermore, never taking into consideration that literature is not nearly as important as literacy. And so there's all this pressure being put on, like, have you read this novel? Have you read these classics? When there are a lot of people who grow up to become brilliant scholars who only read nonfiction, Or there are tons. I mean, look, I haven't read a lot of the classics, and I'm not made a worse person for it. Right? Like all this weird value stuff that we attach to reading, I think is unhealthy and I think can be harmful without thinking about equity and all the other parts of our lives that play a role in everything that we do and everything that we are.
Yeah, and your books are definitely breaking the mold when it comes to this. And obviously, your books are read by millions of people and adults all over the world. So, why do you think that is?
I think it's a good question. First of all, I try not to think about, I try not to think about sort of like what's working, because I'm scared that I'll talk myself out of it working, right? But the truth is, if I had to sort of empiricalize it, if I had to nail down some sort of thing that I think it is, I think human beings are attracted to honesty more so than they're even attracted to truth. Those two things are not the same, right? What you get from me on those pages is honesty. It doesn't mean I'm always right. It doesn't mean it's always true, but it does mean I'm always me, right? No matter what, you're gonna get an honest version of whoever I am, channeled through those characters at any given moment. The other thing is that I approach my work with humility, intimacy, and gratitude. I am, I talk to my buddies all the time, my contemporaries, my friends, my mentors, and there's all this stuff in the literary world. When you ask a writer who they write for, their response will be, I write for myself, right? That is the canned answer. And I think it's bogus. I think it's bogus, right? I think it's reductive. And the reason why is because I'm almost 40. And and the books I'm writing are about 16-year-olds. It is foolish and disingenuous to say that I am writing for me. I'm not. But because if I'm going to write about or trying to connect with 16-year-olds, then I need to be thinking about 16-year-olds. I need to have them in mind, right? I need to be consciously sort of trying to connect and figure out what the sort of pathways are and the tethering points are so that I can make that sort of transaction, that sort of interaction, right? If not, then what am I wasting my time for if I'm just writing for me? I could write for 40-year-olds if I'm writing for me. You know what I mean? And
Yeah.
I think that intention is what shines through.
It's very interesting. And at the beginning, you mentioned honesty, right? And coming through authentically. And your writing really it's tremendously powerful. It's visceral. And it's changed a lot of lives. And often, it seems so true that and with writers of fiction, I think it's an interesting question. How much of your work, if anything, comes from your own personal experience? Is there any biography to it?
For sure, for sure. And I know it's interesting because I didn't come to writing through the academic sort of the typical academic route. There is a lot of discussion about like biography in fiction and about if it's a good thing to do that, or do you want? I don't even know them rules, bro. I don't know them rules. For me, all I have are my stories, right? I lived a colorful life, one that was tough at times and that I could not see the power in. But then I got older and realized I got all these stories to tell. So you look at a story like Ghost. Ghost is about my homeboy Matt, who grew up down the street. That really happened to him, right? And then I was a track runner, and so I pulled those two stories and made one. You think about Long Way Down. That's about my friend Randell, who was murdered when I was 19 years old. Those are the things that we went through. Those were the rules that I was raised with. You think about All American Boys. Those were the experiences in my neighborhood with police officers, right? Like these are my personal stories. Right now, is it 100% biographical? Of course not. But you know how it is when you eat your mama food, right? Like if whatever your favorite dish is, mac and cheese or whatever it is, it don't matter how many mac and cheeses you taste, you can always tell which one your mama made because your mama can't help but put a little bit of herself in it. That's what it's like to write a book.
Yeah, so it's interesting that you mentioned Long Way Down and the fact that it arose out of clearly a really intense personal experience. So could you just tell us a bit more about, what happened and how it shaped your writing of the book?
Yeah, I mean, we were kids. This is a dude. So like, if anyone's read the Track series, Ghost, Patina, Sonny, and Lou, the character that Sonny is based on is the same character that Sean is based on in Long Way Down. So like, I grew up with a kid named Randall Duncan, who is a neighborhood misfit. an oddball, the most brilliant, most interesting teenager I've ever been around. He did everything by the beat of his own drum. And that's what made everybody love him so much. You know, we all know those people where you're like, oh, you weird. And also the coolest person in the whole school, right? Like, you know what I mean? And he was that guy. He was that guy. But he also was a petty drug dealer. You know what I mean? Diamond nickel bags, doing what he could to support his mom. And you know, a lot of us go through that period where you're like, I'm trying to figure out how to get a little extra money for this or get a little extra money for that. I mean, just stuff that you deal with sometimes, not everybody, thankfully, but it's a reality of our lives. I mean, y'all in New York, you know what I'm talking about, you know? And it was a bad night. We were 19 years old. I got a phone call and they said that they'd murdered him and they left his body in a cemetery, burned to death. And I remember going to his mother's house that evening and telling his mom that we would, you know, that we would find out who did this and we would return the favor. We would avenge his death, you know. And I knew for a fact in that moment that I meant every single word. I knew I could have done it. I knew I could have committed murder and then slept like a baby that night, because that is a part of our humanity that we pretend doesn't exist. But that kind of anger, that kind of rage lives within all of us. If triggered, if activated, right? Ask your parents, who I hope are peaceful people, but ask them who they'd be if something, God forbid, were to happen to you. Then you'll see a different side of them, right? And so I met that part of myself very young. And I wanted to write this book. You know, people have sort of reduced it and some oversimplified it into a story about gun violence, right? Because buzzwords sell books.
Right.
So this is a book about gun violence. And the truth is that this is a book about a little boy. This is what happens when the weight of the world is on a child's shoulders and their backs are against the wall, and everyone will blame him for not having what no one ever gave him. Like, that's what this is about. It's about the kids in Harlem and the kids in Brooklyn, and right. It's about the kids who feel like, well, what exactly is the right way when this is the only way I know? And I feel like, based on the context and the framework of my life, that this is the best decision I can make to survive in this moment, right? Who's going to be honest about the fact that those kids are not gangsters, they're not criminals, they're not monsters, they're just children, and we have failed them, right? We, the adults, the government, the educational system, right? We have failed them, but we will blame them for their fate, and that's what Long Way Down is truly about.
Yeah, and you mentioned education just then, and I think it's interesting. Now you're the national ambassador for young people's literature at the Library of Congress. What do you like about that job, and what do you hope to do with that role?
What do I like about it? The medal. There's nothing else about it that's different. I've been doing this since before they gave me the title, and I'll be doing it when my appointment is over, right? It has always been my job to make reading and writing feel like something that is for everyone, despite where you come from and what you've been through, and that your story ain't got to be straightforward or something or a cliche. That it could be completely different than the people around you, and you can still find yourself in a relationship with language. That language in and of itself is for all of us. It's just that somehow we've been convinced that it isn't, only because the language that many of us naturally speak has been criticized, critiqued, and undervalued. Right? If I am from, I lived in New York for a long time, and the one thing that I used to love about New York is that and as you all know, depending upon the neighborhood you're in, there's a different lexicon. I remember teaching in Queensbridge. They had a whole different slang than my neighborhood in Bed-Stuy, right? And they would teach me their words. We're talking about, this is still like this is Queensbridge. Like, I'm talking 30 minutes on the train, and it's a very different sort of like slang and dialect. Whereas, or if you go to the Bronx, or if you go to Staten Island, right? Completely different, right? And what happens is you somehow along the way, somebody's going to tell you that the English that you speak ain't the right kind of English. And the truth of the matter is that, well, this is America. We don't speak, none of us speak, quote unquote, the right kind of English in America because we are in America. So we speak an American version of English, which means in and of itself, based in the root of America, in the diversity of America, that all of the sort of Englishes are forms of American English, but that all of them are being influenced by the sort of cultural context in which they come. I don't want my version, my mama's language, my neighborhood language to be seen as less than because it doesn't fit with some supposed standard. And if you want me to learn the standard, I will, as long as you validate my language too, right? That's all I want to say to kids. Hey, you know what? You if you're a first generation, let's say you're first generation Mexican American, let's say you're in ESL class and right now you're speaking Spanglish, guess what? That's good with me, right? You don't have to change who you are to sort of learn the new thing or the thing that sort of standardizes things, even though standardization is a whole other conversation we can talk about later. But what if we bigged up everybody's sort of version of English? What if we taught Shakespeare by, what I used to do is I would teach, I taught for a moment. And so I would teach Shakespeare, and I would teach Shakespeare by having people translate it from Shakespearean English to American, quote unquote, standard English to neighborhood English, right? And what would happen is the young people would be like, you know, they would feel big and seen because they could speak neighborhood language, they could speak their local sort of dialect. They understood the American standardized English and they could comprehend William Shakespeare, right? You could do all those things without having to invalidate somebody based on their cultural sort of context.
Yeah, so you bring up this really interesting idea of like the standard that we're all supposed to follow. And the standard is present in so many aspects of our everyday lives. Like in classrooms nationwide, kids are reading the same books over and over again, and they're part of this so-called canon, and they usually center white protagonists. So what to you are the problems with that system, and how does it affect the students that aren't white?
I mean, first of all, the biggest issue with the idea of the canon, especially as we pertain to what we call the classics, is that we never actually ask ourselves who's classics. Who's classics? Because if you're talking to my mother, a 75-year-old woman from South Carolina, she's gonna tell you right off the bat that Toni Morrison and Alice Walker and Langston Hughes are her classics because they were. Because they were, right? So the first question is, the first thing that we have to do is recognize that every single culture has classics of their own. Every culture. Right? I think about Pablo Neruda, right? If you're Chilean, he's a part of your, I think about Marquez and Allende, right? I mean, there's so many people that we can talk about that are classics in context with their culture, right? It's just that so the bigger issue is that the assumption that white culture is the culture that we all exist in, and it's just not true, right? This idea that there is a standard that is coming through the lens of whiteness that we're all supposed to adhere to, which makes no sense, especially when we think about a country that prides itself on being one of freedom and diversity. It's all just fascinating. The other thing though is, and this is just me being completely honest with y'all, because I love you enough to tell you how I really feel. You know, the Cameron Project may never invite me back. That's okay. I'm okay with it. I've been there. It's happened before. But the other thing I think about all the time is a lot of our teachers only teach what they know and not what they want us to know, just what they know, right? I remember doing these poetry workshops, right? So funny. And we'd be in the room and we'd be sharing our poems, and I'd be the only Black person or the only brown person in the room, and everybody's sharing their poems, and they all sound like John Ashbery because there was a moment where everybody came to the school of Ashbery, right? And they're doing their Ashbery thing, and then they get to me, and I'm coming through a different tradition, and so my poems are sort of iterative of the Harlem Renaissance. And I'm doing my thing, or the Black Arts Movement, right? I'm coming through that tradition. And when they would workshop and critique me, they would say that my work was rudimentary, that it was immature, that it was too simple, right? Not realizing that to be ambiguous is a privilege. It's a privilege. To risk someone not understanding is a privilege that historically Black and brown folks have not had when it comes to art. It's the reason why I mean, go back and read the Harlem. You understood exactly what Langston Hughes was saying. You understood exactly what he was trying. There was no time to waste being vague. Like, I can't waste these words when my people are dying outside my home. Different cultural contexts, right? So they're critiquing me and they're killing me, slaughtering me, right? Meanwhile, when they critique each other, they have all these reference points. Oh my God, this reminds me of Ashbury. Oh my God, this reminds me of Locke. Oh my God, you remind me of Whitman. Oh my, right? They're going through the list. And then and these are all Harvard, Princeton, Yale, the whole nine, right? And then I say, who do I remind you of? And they say, we don't really know, we've never. And then I say, you mean to tell me that in your fancy education, you've learned all of these people and not one of these people have been Black and brown? You have not had to study any of my folks, but I have had to study yours my entire life. So I know Whitman. I could recite you Whitman like it's nothing, right? I know Shakespeare. I know Locke. I know Pope. I know Ashbury. I could do all of that. And I could do Amiri Baraka, Nikki Giovanni. I could do Hakeem Matabuti. I could do all of them too. And I could do Pablo Neruda and all the Chilean poets. And I could give you some Rumi. We could do all of that, right? And they didn't see any value in it because they never had to learn it. And what they don't understand is that they're the ones at a disadvantage for that. They're at a disadvantage. I got a much broader and bigger quiver with more arrows than they could imagine because I had no choice. Whereas they were given a much more distilled education, and that education was said to be a premier and elite education when really it's actually quite small. That's why we should expand the canon. That's why we should do away with the idea of canon in the first place. Furthermore, things change. The fact that we are still studying, look, you ever think about, and I'm gonna finish my rant soon because I can feel this is like one of those conversations where I feel myself getting like, you ever think about how, and y'all are New Yorkers, so it's a little bit different, but let's say you weren't in New York. Let's say y'all grew up in, let's say you grew up in, no, New York is fine. Let's say you grew up in New York. You ever realize, like in math class, y'all was still doing word problems about trains going through tunnels. Right now, y'all got the subway, right? Y'all got the subway, so there are trains going through tunnels. But think about the fact that the trains they talking about are like freight trains going through tunnels. We ain't been on freight trains in 100 years. And the math problems presented to us are still about the timing of trains going through tunnels, right? There is something wrong with the idea that timelessness is of value. When the truth of the matter is that if times are changing, then the things that we study should also be evolving as well, especially as it pertains to language. If people are studying long way down 40 years from now, then we failed. It should not last forever. It should not. It should be used as a reference point of what it was like to write during this era. But students shouldn't be reading Ghost 40 years from now. We should have evolved, and the work should have evolved. And that's not what has happened in terms of the way literature is taught.
No, it's really interesting that you mentioned that, and talking about broadening horizons, I think is really important. And I know we've got a lot of teachers watching tonight. So as a sort of follow-up, what do you think that teachers and everybody really can do to help affect that change in classrooms and in school curriculum?
So here's what I'm going to say, Lucas, is that first is I'm always careful when it comes to being prescriptive for teachers because I respect them too much, and I'm not a teacher. And there's one thing that we all hate is people from the outside thinking they know what we go through. And teachers got a lot on their plates, and the truth is that a lot of the times where teachers, for lack of better words, where teachers sometimes fall short, has nothing to do with them and everything to do with the political system in place that makes it almost impossible for them to truly do their jobs. So first, I want to say that. And to all the teachers who are listening, I got love for you. I'm grateful for you, especially the ones that actually love these kids. By the way, if you are a teacher who loves these children, the children know, the young folks know. And if you are a teacher who doesn't, the young folks know. Just so we're clear. But for those who really are in this thing for the right reasons, I think all I can really say is we have to continue to stretch ourselves. We can't get comfortable with the lesson plans of last year. We got to try right? And it might mean a little more work for us, right? I recognize that, but we have to try. We have to recognize that our jobs isn't to teach literature. Um, it's to help young people become whole as they get older. They're already whole, by the way, right? But as they continue to grow, it's to help them remain whole, right? It's to help them sort of stay whole as they sort of become adults and as life gets more and more complicated. Like that's what we're really trying to do. But in order to do so, you gotta open up the world that you're teaching them, right? You got to make sure that you're presenting to them possibility. Like we talk about diversity, but what we're really talking about is possibility, right? And I think that is the most important thing. And I think we have to lean into the uncomfortable stuff. I'm so impressed with young people, man. I got so much love because I'm around young folks enough to know, especially y'all generation. I'm around y'all enough to know that y'all are better than us, and I mean it. And adults have a hard time with it. It's like, we give a lot of lip service about how we want y'all to be the future. Yeah, man, young people. The truth of the matter is, y'all already better than us. The problem is that y'all don't know, right? Like that's where we get a little hiccup, right? But anybody who's really paying attention, I mean, we rag on y'all all the time. We say y'all too soft, right? With all your pronouns and right? We talk all this trash about y'all, right? But when you really think about that, what we're really saying is, I can't stand them for being so empathetic. How dare they want equity for everyone? How dare they want a place for everyone to feel safe? Who do they think they are to try to create a world where everybody is seen and heard? It's not so bad, yo. And then we say all they care about is social media. All they care about is their video games and TikTok dances. And I'm like, Slim, give them a chance. They 16. Who were you at 16? Right? And so I'm actually rooting for y'all. And so I think the teachers should sort of teach should sort of create curriculum believing that you all are already there, waiting for them to meet you there with the curriculum, right? It's like, I feel like y'all are like, yo, we should really be studying race theory, right? Why are we not studying critical race theory in high school? Why do we have to wait to college before we start studying critical race theory when we're having conversations, good, bad, ugly, or indifferent, about race all the time? Because we have to, because it's in our faces, because we are growing up with cell phones. So the best thing you could do is start informing us with critical race theory in the 11th grade. Imagine what that would be like. So that by the time you were 25, you had actual lexicon to actually change the country. You had language for everything. Y'all waiting for it. So teachers should say, like, we should just meet them where they are. We should trust that they're bigger than we even know. That's what I think.
Yeah, and this idea of reforming the curriculum so it actually represents different communities, equally is, I think, something that's super important. And it's also a really big theme throughout your work. In all of your books, you aim to shine a light on people that are never represented in literature and media. So to you, what do you think the power of visibility and feeling represented is?
So this is a twofold answer, because I think that there's a power there and I think there's a danger there. And I'm going to tell you both. I think the power is, there's a famous quote by Alfred Hitchcock, whom I love because he changed American cinema, right? And the quote is, a face is not a face until I put light on it, right? Another example of this would be all of our spiritual beliefs, right? No matter what you believe in, doesn't matter, right? It doesn't matter what it is. Whatever we deem as, whoever or whatever we deem as the big powerful thing that we can't see, we can't hear, we can't smell. But the moment we attach a name to it, it becomes real, right? Without the naming of the thing, it's really hard to conceptualize it. But once we attach language to it, it becomes something that we feel like we can touch and hold, or at least believe in, right? The same goes for representation in literature. This is our form of shining light and making the thing exist. This is our form of attaching language to something that without it seems ephemeral. And if we do not do this, then we run the risk of human beings believing that they do not exist in the world. And that is real. Even though they have physical bodies, we run the risk of there being physical bodies moving around the world believing that they are invisible because they have never been given any light or language. It's that simple. Now, the danger in representation is that people run the risk of believing that representation is enough. And it is not. There are a lot of companies and schools and classrooms and bookstores and publishing companies who will do anything to make sure they can check boxes of representation so that they can stay out the hot water. That's not enough. We're talking about true equity. We're talking about freedom, right? We're talking about truth. We're talking about love. That all requires work and action and sacrifice and discomfort. Right, so representation is good, but it's only good if it's seen as a base level. Right, this is a starting point, a springboard, because it doesn't make sense for you to show me in a book but not give me voice, not make me a fully fleshed out character, not give me a range of human emotion. Right, like all of that has to be a part of it.
Yeah, and it's really interesting that you bring up, fleshing out your character and really capturing the wholeness of your characters, basically. And something I think that's a big focus of your writing is not only portraying the struggles, but the joys of being Black and really showing us the entirety of the Black experience. So why do you think this positivity is such a powerful tool?
Y'all are so good at this. This is I'm so confused on how this is happening. I'm like, man, this is the best interview. Let me say, this is the 5th interview I've had today. And I'm like, this is what I'm talking about. This is so much better than all the other ones. You asked about the sort of, so I'll make sure I'm clear, but I was so taken by the fact that you would, forgive me, but I'm just like, this is what I'm talking about. You're asking about sort of showing the range of Blackness. Can you give me one more time what you were asking?
Yeah, so I guess my ultimate question is, why do you think portraying that positivity is a powerful tool?
Because it's real, right? Because it's true. Listen, you don't go through what Black folks have gone through and not laugh. Right? Now I know everybody else thinks like, no, you mean you don't go through it and not cry? No. I'm saying you don't go through it and not, look, laughter has been a survival mechanism. It is joy has been the most revolutionary thing that Black folks have ever done. Is claim their joy, own it, harness it, even in the midst of dark times. And by the way, not every time is a dark time. We've always been happy. We've always found joy. We've always found dance, music, song, love. And the reason why is because Black people, whether people know it or not, are human beings. Human. My mother used to always tell us to always be leery and be careful around folks who don't never laugh. Right? It's always everything bad in your life, everything rough. It's like, no, there's always something to laugh at. Even the things that are hard, when you really think about it, can be pretty funny. I mean, in the Black community, Black tradition, funerals are a trip, because they sad, and then they get pretty absurd at times. And it's funny. And we allow ourselves to lean into the absurdity of our lives, even though we know that we don't deserve the absurdity to be there sometimes. But it is what it is. I mean, comedians have built their whole careers on figuring out how to laugh at our pain, and at our stuff. And I want to show that. And I want to show that there are a lot of people who ain't in pain. There are a lot of Black folks who just live mundane lives. Like, this is weird, like this weird sort of expectation that Black people live like all of our lives are like explosions. It's like we all live in Marvel movies. You know what I mean? And it's like, nah, yo, I just go to school and go to work and come home and, you know what I'm saying, eat tuna fish and call it a night. Like, I'm trying to watch the game. I want to call my friend. Like, a weekend is a weekend for Black folks, like it is for everybody. Like, it's weird, right? I'm trying to take care of my kids. It's not this weird explosive situation all the time. It's just normal life, and every now and then there's a hiccup. But for the most part, Black folks are banal like everybody else.
Yeah, that's certainly fascinating. And I want to switch gears just for a second, because we couldn't be here and not talk to you about Stamped. And so you came out with Stamped around a year ago. And my first question for you is that at the beginning of the book, you say that Stamped isn't a history book.
Mm.
And it seems, and I know you repeat that throughout. So what kind of book then is it?
Mm. You know, it is a book that contains history, for sure, and that examines history, but it's not a history book. And the reason why, first of all, I want to be clear about why it says why I say that in the book. Number one is because when I was young, I hated history books. So, and a lot of people hate history books, especially the ones that we think of school and we think of like textbooks and we think of all of this kind of thing. So I needed to figure out ways to make sure that I engage with y'all in a way that felt like, oh, all right, thank God it's not going to be that, right? So it's like, don't worry, this is not going to be like the ones you have in school. This is going to be something a little different, something that leans in to what you already know and sort of taps into who you are right now today, right? And so that was the first thing, just using it as a hook to like crack jokes and poke fun at the books that I hated when I was in high school, right? Honestly. The other thing though is that because when we talk about history, we tend to talk about it in a vacuum, right? Language is important, right? The moment that we call something historic, we separate ourselves from it, right? Just definitively, it's what we do, right? If it's historic, it happened there, then, right? When the truth is that everything is perennial and everything exists on a continuum, and then is now, and now is tomorrow, and whatever changes in the midst of this continuum on these ticker dots on this continuum has everything to do with the way that we're discussing and moving in this moment, right? It cannot change the past, but it can surely change the future, right? But in order to do so, we have to sort of wrestle with the fact that the past is not actually the past. Right? That the past, that we're really living in this weird sort of it's like our whole lives are technically like liminal space. Neither then, like it's neither there or there, right? It was all like this liminal space that we're manipulating every single day, and what it becomes, what it morphs into, is completely dependent upon our ability to lean into this comfort and the truth of what happened in that weird part of the liminal space then, right? But it isn't this like far away time, right? It isn't forever ever land. It's like, nah, it's like my mama couldn't ride the bus. My mom, like that ain't long ago, right? It's like my mom could not get a job. My mother couldn't ride the bus. My mother couldn't eat in restaurants. My mom. So I think that's the reason why I wanted to tackle it as a not history book, you know.
Yeah, so it's interesting that you bring up that, you didn't like reading history books as a young person because your version of Stamped, this remix of Professor Kendi's 2016 Stamped from the Beginning is aimed towards a younger demographic. So can you just walk us through like what was that like, working with Professor Kendi and fine-tuning his ideas for a younger audience?
It was brutal. It was brutal. You know what? So here's the truth about what happened with that book. I didn't want to do it in the first place. It was never in my plans. I had no desire to do anything like this. I'm a fiction writer. I like imagination. I like to lie, right? Make up things and to have a good time making a mess of things in my own world. Uh, but I also love Kendi as my God, and I've known him, and he asked me to do it. Yo, can you do this thing for me? I think it'll be important. I think it'll be good. And I said no. I said, I can't, absolutely not, you know? And it's funny because people always ask me like, why would you say no to this project? As if they would have said yes. Right? I'm like, oh, so you would have said yes, huh? You would have taken this on. This book, this masterpiece, a 600-page academic tome, and written in a way that we had never seen before, shifting the entire sort of way that we're thinking about, or at least talking about race in America. And you think that it's easy to just say yes to this, right? So I said no. I said no 3 or 4 times. He asked me over and over again over the course of 6 or 7 months. And I kept saying no. And here's the reason why. Because I wasn't a good student. I'm not good at researching. I'm not good at taking notes. Right? Like we gotta be, it's so funny because I talk to young folks all the time, and these are the moments where teachers everybody get all squeamish, like, Jesus, this guy, we're supposed to be, hopefully encouraging our scholars to be, excellent. It's like, I am encouraging them to be excellent, but I also know that excellence looks many ways. I wasn't that good at school. I did not understand. I could not. I had a hard time, right? And so because of that, I still live with the insecurities of that. And I didn't want to ruin this man's book. Eventually, he convinced me to say yes. I wrote 2 or 3 drafts over the course of 2 years. They were all terrible. because they were all edited versions of his book, which is what I thought they were asking me to do. Eventually, I decided to quit. Right? Yes, and I want you all to know this. I decided that I'd had enough, and maybe I was in over my head. And so I went to New York to give the money back and to tell them that I would help them find somebody who's more equipped to do the job, a scholar, perhaps, an academic. And they said, you just don't get it, yo. We're asking you to do it because you're not those things, right? Because you're like a knucklehead kid who, right? That's why we're asking you to do it. And I'm like, you don't get it though. Like, in order for me to do this my way, I have to ruin his book. I have to make fun of it. I have to pick it apart. And they say, we understand that, but that's what we want you to try to, like, give it a shot. And then I said yes. And on the way home, I said, I just can't. I called my mom. I said, yo, they want me to do this thing, but like, I hated that kind of stuff in school. I hate history books. Just like that. And that's the reason the first line is, this is not a history book. And 2 months later, mind you, I've been working on this book for 2 years. 2 months later, wrote a whole new draft, and we were done. We were done, right? Because I wrote it as myself. Like I said, I can't promise you all a lot, but I can promise you honesty. And that book, the tone of it, the style of it, is just me being honest, right? About me, about who I am, and about what I believe you all will at least attach yourselves to. If I could just be honest, right? If I could be honest, I'm like, I have to trust that in my honesty, the humanity in me will attach itself to the humanity and the honesty in you. And y'all will be like, yo, this is what I'm talking about. This feels different. I'm along for the ride, right? And that was it.
No, that's very interesting to hear the story of that book. And I think so many of us are so glad that you did it your way. Before we move to the Q&A, I'd like to ask you one question, because we have a lot of teachers, but we also have a lot of students, not to mention Kanisha and I. So what advice do you have? And you mentioned, the leaning into tough stuff earlier. What advice do you have for students, for young people who are trying to do just that? We're trying to have the tough conversations about racism, about sexism, about a lot of the things we need to talk about.
I think, so here's the thing. I think that the discomfort is always going to be there, but there's never been a moment in our lives where discomfort has not propelled us to grow, right? Like discomfort, we have to make, and I know I keep going back to the language, but that's my field. That's where I work in, right? We have to make sure that we don't conflate definitions. There is a difference between being uncomfortable and being unsafe. One of the things about your generation that I love is that you all have named things in a way that we couldn't do. One of the things that concerns me is that sometimes it conflates definitions, right? A prime example is the concept, the idea of safety. Doesn't mean that there aren't moments where, it doesn't mean that mental and emotional safety aren't real, because they are. Because they really, really are, right? I'm never going to be the person to sort of criticize the idea of a safe space, or I'm not interested in being critical of what you all do, because I think that it's working for you all and it's making the world a better place. But that being said, rather, I think that we have to be careful in conversations around race as it pertains to safety, because what happens is people will then say, well, I don't feel safe in this conversation. And if that person, let's say, is a white person, a young white person who's like, yo, I don't feel safe. What has to be discussed is like your feeling of being unsafe might very well be making the body of someone else unsafe, right? So we have to be clear about being uncomfortable, which is what you really feel, and being unsafe. You see what I'm saying? And that has to be sort of set out at the beginning, and understanding that being uncomfortable is okay. That's the reason why in STAMP I keep saying, let's pause, take a breath, right? Because you're still fine. You're still fine, right? You might be a little uncomfortable, might have a lump in your throat, might have wells in your eyes, but your body is, you're fine. But having this conversation and you having to deal with 20 minutes of a lump in your throat might really mean that somebody else might be able to walk home without having to deal with harassment from a police officer. It's that real. It's that real. Right? And I think that's why we have to lean into it. The other thing, though, is that I always play by a rule that I call the offensive defensive rule. What does this mean? This means that there's never a moment where I am trying to be offensive. Therefore, there is never a moment where you should feel the need to be defensive, right? If we're having a conversation, let's learn how to have discourse. We really have lost our way when it comes to the ability to just communicate. Everything is not an argument. Everything is not a fight, right? It's okay for us to have some discourse. It's even okay for us to disagree. It's just not okay for us to disengage. And that's what oftentimes happens, right? If you can keep all those things in mind and approach these things with an open heart and an open mind, I think you all, your generation, will start to turn the corner. And the other thing I'll say this, because I want to be very honest with you, Lucas. If you are, look, we all have to listen, but I want to be clear. If you are a white person in this discussion, which is necessary in order for it to change, we all have to be a part of it. You have to be careful not to be dismissive of the experiential truths of Black people, brown people, and people of color in general, right? You have to be careful, because what happens is, I've been in these discussions and it's been good folks, right? Well-meaning folks who, the moment I tell the truth, something I've experienced, my mother, my father, my brothers, then the statistics come out, right? And we roll out the statistics and we say, well, the stats say right here. Let me tell you something about stats. And then we're gonna take Q&A. Let me tell you something about statistics. The idea around statistics is that numbers don't lie, which is a fallacy. It's not true. Numbers are all about who has control of the narrative when it comes to interpreting what those numbers say. Prime example, when I came into this industry, you know what they said? We don't want to publish you because Black boys don't read books. So we don't want to, the statistics say Black boys don't read, so publishing you is bad for business, says the person controlling that narrative. But when I see those numbers, I say, Black boys don't read, so y'all should probably publish me so we could give them something to read, right? Same numbers, different narrative. So be careful when it comes to the whole, like, let's pull out stats. If somebody got something to say from personal experience, just take a moment and listen. Just listen and be a human, empathize, you know? Y'all do all of that, y'all be all right.
No, I think you're really right. And thank you for saying that. We're going to move into the Q&A now, and we've got a lot of great questions. A lot of people signed up with questions, and I see there are around 50 that have been asked live. So we've got some stuff to talk about.
Try to run through. I'll be less long-winded. I try to run through.
Yeah. So the first question I've got is a pre-registered question, and it's from Cheryl Robertson, who's a teacher. And Cheryl asks, if you could give one piece of advice to white teachers teaching predominantly in white schools who want to affect change in terms of the racial inequities that we face as a country, what would that be?
Don't be afraid to learn it together. Pedagogy is an interesting thing because it's set up in a certain hierarchical space where the teacher is supposed to be instructing the students, but most of the time the teachers don't know either when it comes to this conversation. So I think a dope thing to do would be to say that this class is a class where we're all going to learn together. That would be dope. And then lean into the uncomfortable conversations. Be leery of the parents though. And if you work in an all-white school, you know exactly what I'm talking about. The parents are coming for you. And if that happens, start a book club.
All right, and we have a question from another teacher. I hope I'm pronouncing this right. Jill Sinet. She says that recently a teaching coach at her school told her that through the literature she was selecting for her students to read, she was contributing to this narrative of the single story. And she's asking, is she contributing to the single story by teaching books like Dear Martin, All American Boys, and Allegedly in her classroom?
It's complicated. It's complicated. I don't know if she's contributing to the idea of a single story. I understand where that everybody quotes Chimamanda on that, and I understand what the critique is. The real question is whether or not this teacher who is using these books are speaking about the character in these books as humans and not symbols. Right? So that's what I would offer. I'm never going to tell you not to teach Allegedly or Dear Martin or whatever, All American Boys, right? Those books oftentimes get sort of whittled down into what people call issues books, but they're not that. They're books about teenagers. And so the real question is, when you're teaching them, are you teaching more than the issue? Are you doing your best to acknowledge the humanity of the students in the books? I mean, of the characters in the books. Are you seeing them as human beings and not as caricatures or avatars for issues, right? And if you're doing that, then then the critics can criticize all they want. There is a full range of emotions in All American Boys. They're in high school. There's jokes, there's romance, there's pain, there's trauma, there's family, there's lots of things to explore there. There is no, so it doesn't necessarily fall into the single story. The single story concept would apply if you were using all these books simply to talk about the downtroddenness of Black life. That is the single story, and that is not fair. And if you're doing that, then I would say that that is a problem. And you should add some other books into this category to show that Black people are more than just victims, right? That I agree with. But if you don't want to add new books, you can just explode the novels and do a deep reading about the humanity of the people in the books, not their victimhood.
That's great. I've got another question here from Fatima Borgi. And this is a question that's been asked live. And guys, please just get all your questions in there. We'll get to as many as we can. And thank you for asking them. So she asks, what kind of books did you find yourself attached to, or could you see yourself in as a young person?
No books for me. Didn't read any books as a young person. I saw myself in rap music. That was everything. I grew up in the 80s and the early 90s when rap was brand new and it was just like becoming a thing. And you could only get it on the East Coast and in California, and it just started to bubble in the South. But rap music was where I kind of found my way and found my language and found my identity and storytelling and all of that. So it came a little later for me. And when I started reading, it was all about Black stories that reminded me of my granddaddy and my uncles, and right, like Richard Wright and James Baldwin and Alice Walker and all those tales. And then eventually it became other things, of course.
Yeah, so in the audience, Alice asks, how did you find your voice as a writer, and how does that voice differ from your voice in the flesh?
Oh, it don't differ. if y'all read my books, sounds just like this. Just like this. But I found my voice as a writer when I allowed myself to be myself. School is a complicated thing because it teaches you how to do things in the way that it teaches you how to do them. It doesn't teach you how to be you, though. Nobody can teach you that, right? And so the only thing I truly have is a gut. I got intuition. And the moment that I unlearned what I learned in school, which, by the way, is the point of school, right? Is to teach you all these rules so that you know how to break them later on in life and in the real world, how to manipulate and bend them into what you need them to be. If everybody followed the rules, then the world would be a bummer, right? Nothing gets made by following rules. And so once I started to sort of unlearn and manipulate those rules and manipulate what I learned in poetry, manipulate what I learned when I finally started reading, figuring out that I actually had more freedom than people made it seem like. You do know they call it language arts, but we never talk about the arts part. You're an artist. You're an artist, right? And if you're an artist, then it's okay for you to stretch out. And it's in that stretching that you'll find your voice.
And we've got another question here, again, in our pre-registration, from Kim Clifton, who is a teacher. And she asks, what books are you reading right now?
Ooh, what am I reading at the moment? I don't even know. I know I'm reading, what is going on in here? Oh yeah. I'm reading like a lot of essay stuff, like old Italian. I'm reading a lot of translated works because I think Americans, we're the only sort of literary system globally that doesn't read translated works, which is so weird. Everywhere else in the world, my books are translated in like 75 languages, and yet my partners across the pond cannot get their books published in America, right? And I think it's doing us a grave disservice because we have no global perspective. And so I've been reading a ton of just translated stuff, West African literature, South African literature, Italian literature, Dutch and German literature, which is wow. German literature is amazing. So that kind of stuff.
Yeah, and another pre-registered question. Kathleen Palmatier, a teacher, wants to know, which of your books is your favorite and which one was the most difficult to write?
Boy in the Black Suit is my favorite. Boy in the Black Suit is my favorite. I think it's the best thing I've ever written. and I may never top it. The most difficult to write was As Brave as You. The book right after that was the worst, the hardest process ever. My first time writing in third person, my first middle grade book. It was a long story, a lot of characters. It just was a lot for me. But those were the two.
And we got another live question here from Leslie Berger. And she says, I'm a high school English teacher. Any suggestions for getting kids excited about language and reading to whom it doesn't come naturally or who haven't been exposed to it earlier?
Yeah, let them read whatever they want. Open it up. You know, honestly, I've been in schools where I try to tell students, I'm like, what you like to do? They say, I don't like reading. I like playing Fortnite. Cool. Well, there's books on it. So I get you a cheat code book. You can figure out how to be better at the game. I don't really care what you read. I just care about that you're reading, that you're exercising that muscle. And here's why. And I want to make sure I get this out. Here's why. Reading is the only way that we can build brain muscle, right? So if I go to the gym and I lift weights, it helps me build the muscles in my arms and legs. But what builds the mind muscle, right? Reading does. It doesn't matter what you read, though, per se. We like to believe that, like, oh, they got to read these novels because it builds empathy in people. Yet I know so many professors who have read every single novel who were terrible to me and didn't empathize at all. So that's not true, right? What it actually does is it gives you vocabulary to be able to express your feelings and emotions and your ideas. And if you can do that, then you can sort of pave road for yourself, and you can be less violent and less confrontational, physically confrontational. It helps you sort of understand how to navigate the world around you because your brain is sort of functioning at a higher clip. And most importantly, it teaches you soft skills like concentration and diligence and persistence, how to sit down for a second and focus, how to listen, not just to other people, but how to listen to yourself, because all those things are required when you are reading. So I don't care what you read, just read something. Sports Illustrated magazine, I don't care what it is. Anything goes, rap lyrics, whatever. Exercise the muscle.
Yeah, so our next question was in the pre-registered questions from Fiona McManus, who's a student, and she's asking, what is your take on the elitist element of anti-racism in American society? Specifically, how private institutions and universities so obviously perpetuate a racist system while also claiming to be against it. How can anti-racism become a completely universal and accessible concept rather than a buzzword in seminars?
You tell me. I'm with you. I don't have the answer. I don't know. I think that because of social media and because of the way the world ticks at this point, everything becomes a buzzword over time. You remember what happened to woke, right? Everything becomes a buzzword. It's one of those things that happen. But my job isn't to, because I feel you. I'm with you. But my job is also to think about the fact that, like, as much as these institutions pretend to do things that they don't actually do, there are everyday people who actually do care, and I got to focus on them. I can't change. We can't save them all, right? For it to be a universal thing, I think that the danger in that sort of in that idea, even though it's what we all want, the danger in that is to assume that there's a finish line, but there is not a finish line. This is a forever process. This will go on forever. There will never be a day where we live in a completely anti-racist world or society, because racism in and of itself continues to change and morph, much like sexism and misogyny. Imagine myself saying to myself, you know what, I am no longer a misogynist. That's a dangerous thing. And what it does is it puts me in a situation to be more harmful than I even was before when I was working against my own misogyny. I'd rather be a person on the journey fighting against misogyny every single day instead of hoping to someday not just, I will no longer be one. That don't exist. It's not a thing. I live in a country that has protected me as a man and set up a barrier around me to be this way, right? So in order to break the barrier down, to chip away at it, I got to do that every single day. But the day I say the barrier's gone, everyone around me will be harmed, right? And that's the way we have to think about it. Don't worry. These institutions, they're going to do what they do. You make sure you do what you do, right? That's all you can really focus on.
I hope you have time. Maybe we're thinking about doing 2 more questions. Yeah.
I got you.
Great. So we've got a question here from Joe Turner in live, and he's asking what advice you might give to a young person who's interested in becoming a writer.
You know, I always love this question because my answer is such a bummer, and I love to do it because I'm like, dang, you know, to be a writer, one has to write. And it seems like such a silly answer, but it's the most honest answer. And because what happens is I meet people all the time who want to be writers. They say they want to be writers, and you see them a year from now and they say they're thinking about starting their story. And you see them 5 years from now and they say, I'm just getting ready to get going. And you see them 10 years from now and they say, man, I got to get back to that story. And the truth of the matter is that writing is about doing the thing, not talking about doing the thing, right? Then you're a talker, right? You're an ideator. You know what I mean? To write is to write, to literally sit down and make it happen. The other piece of advice I'll give you is that don't be afraid of writing badly, because you are going to write badly. It's silly to be afraid of the inevitable. You are going to write trash. All of us do. That first draft is going to be a mess, and that second draft, the first book is going to be a mess, maybe the second one too. Like, this is just the process. And then lastly, if you're afraid of hard work, this ain't going to be for you. Right? So you got to ask yourself, if the question of is it difficult or easy comes to mind, I would tell you that difficult and easy are irrelevant questions. The only thing that matters is, are you going to do it or are you not? And if you're not, then don't talk about it.
Yeah, and just to wrap up the Q&A portion, we've got a question from Eliza Flores, who's a student. She's asking, how do you express your ideas and thoughts without having fear that people can ridicule you and your opinion?
Oh, it's a good question. I'm gonna tell you what my mama told me a long, long time ago, and it saves my life every day. What other people think about me is none of my business. That's all.
I think that's a pretty great mantra. And on that note, I think we'll wrap things up. We're at 6. We've taken an hour of your time, and thank you so much for being here. And thank you everybody for joining us. If you want to follow the Decameron Project, we'll have a lot more events like these, and not quite as great as people like Jason, but maybe we'll come close. And right now we're hosting a story competition with the New School, and the theme is Outside My Window. So if you guys have thoughts about what might be outside your window, please do write. And there is a lot of stuff to be done by just writing a story. So thank you everybody for joining. Thank you, Jason, once again. It's been a real pleasure, and thank you, Kanisha.
My pleasure. Thank y'all, Lucas, Kanisha. Y'all are brilliant. It's been an honor. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Bye-bye, everybody. Have a nice night.